Usually, car salesmen are thought to be the slimiest and most manipulative people in the world. Aside from using pushy sales tactics and predatory financing, car salesmen often don't mind selling you a piece of trash. In fact, they'll probably do it with a smile. Considering this, I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that 87% of American adults dislike something about the car buying process. Also, if you're one of the few people who had a positive experience, many would argue that you got taken advantage of so much that you didn't even realize. But one guy named Bob Brockman actually took advantage of car dealerships so hard that they didn't even realize. Throughout his career, Bob sold overpriced software and hardware to dealerships across the nation, often with multi-decade-long contracts. And after he was done milking the dealerships, Bob turned around and tried to milk the government. But this didn't work out too well as he was charged with the largest tax evasion charge in history. So here's how Bob Brockman made billions by taking advantage of dealerships and the government, and how he eventually got caught. Taking a look back, Bob Brockman was born in 1941 in St. Petersburg, Florida. This was just before the US joined World War II, so Bob was born at the height of the war. But this wasn't too bad for Bob as the war would come to an end by the time he turned 5. Anyway, his dad owned a gas station and his mom worked as a physiotherapist, so he had a pretty comfortable life financially. This allowed him to focus on his education and excel in school. In fact, he graduated summa cum laude, which is the highest distinction from the University of Florida with a business degree in 1963. Bob was also a member of the university's Business Honor Society, so there's no doubt that he was a pretty sharp guy. Out of college, Bob got a marketing job at Ford while also serving in the US Marine Reserves. This didn't last long though, as Bob switched over to IBM in 1966, and this is where he really got his foundation for selling. Bob was tasked with the job of selling IBM's mainframe computer services to car dealers. And out of the gate, Bob was a star performer. Maybe it was his young ambition or his time at Ford. We'll probably never know, but it seemed like Bob was born to sell. Being the star that he was, Bob knew that he didn't really need IBM. So in 1970, he left the company and launched his own company called Universal Computer Services. During his time at IBM, Bob had dealt with dozens of car dealerships and he knew exactly what they wanted: less paperwork. So he taught himself how to code and developed a piece of software that could synthesize multiple financial statements into one. For people who owned multiple car dealerships, this was a godsend. Soon enough, Bob expanded his software to help dealers with managing inventory, generating weekly reports, and tracking sales, and car dealerships ate this up. Bob leaned into this business over the next 20 years, and he got quite rich as he made hundreds of millions. Up until this point, Bob hadn't really done anything slimy per se. Sure, he might have used some shady sales tactics when selling to dealerships, but for the most part, Bob was simply offering an extremely valuable service to dealers, and he was rewarded quite handsomely. His next business move, however, wasn't nearly as moral. In the early 1990s, Ford decided that they were done with the IT world, so they started looking for buyers for their IT division. Given that this was right up Bob's alley, he made an offer for $103 million, but he had one condition. He wanted the rights to use Ford's logos and branding for 5 years. Now, this was a pretty odd request, but Bob was already running a respectable software business, and Ford probably thought that Bob simply wanted some time to rebrand the company. So they agreed to the deal, but this turned out to be a big mistake. You see, Bob leveraged the trust and respect dealers had for Ford in order to sneak in extremely predatory deals. He charged ludicrous amounts for everyday tech. This included charges such as a $12,000 fee to install a 500MB hard drive and $2,400 for a printer. You would think that dealers would have caught on to these ridiculous fees, but many of them didn't look into their fine print and simply trusted Ford because their fine print was a 12-inch thick contract. When Bob's 5-year license for Ford's branding was up though, many of these dealers were in for a rude awakening. Some of them tried to rebel against Bob, alleging that he had misled them, but Bob was well prepared for this. Any complaint from the dealers was already accounted for in the fine print, and the dealers couldn't just wait it out given that these contracts often extended decades. So many of them tried to go the litigation route by suing Bob. But this just drowned them in legal fees, which were often just as bad as Bob's fees. At the time, it wasn't really clear how bad these dealerships were getting screwed. Dealers that weren't affected simply dismissed the concerns as they should have read the fine print. It wasn't until 10 to 15 years later that Bob's damages finally came to light, as these dealerships began to file for bankruptcy and shut down due to his fees. In 2010, for example, a Californian entrepreneur named Jay Jill decided to expand his empire by purchasing a group of 10 car dealerships. But when he looked into the financials of the group, he realized that the company owed Bob $3 million and that they were supposed to pay him $35,000 every single month. After seeing this, Jay said, quote, "I know unequivocally that I wouldn't do business with this guy even if it was free." Fortunately for Jay, he didn't have to deal with Bob for that long as he agreed to settle for half that amount. But with fees like that, it's no wonder why car salesmen are so pushy. If they don't rip you off, they can't afford to get ripped off themselves. As you would guess, the entire fiasco with Ford wasn't the best for UCS's public reputation. So Bob started looking to rebrand himself in the 2000s. And the perfect opportunity came in 2006 when he got the opportunity to sell his company to Reynolds and Reynolds. Similar to UCS, Reynolds and Reynolds had been selling software to auto dealers since the 1980s. They had mostly grown their software empire through a bunch of acquisitions, and offering to buy UCS was just another one of their routine acquisitions. I don't think they did much due diligence, as a simple glance at Bob's history would have probably put them off. Nevertheless, Reynolds and Reynolds went ahead and purchased UCS for $2.8 billion. And as you would guess, in Brockman fashion, there was one critical contingency for the acquisition. Bob stipulated that he must be made CEO of the merged company for the acquisition to be completed. Reynolds agreed, and it didn't take long for Bob to start ruining their reputation as well. First of all, he went ahead and implemented some smaller rules that were annoying, but not too bad. He refused to hire smokers and forced all employees to get an annual physical to maintain health insurance. Some of his other policies, however, were much more damaging. About 1/3 of Reynolds' revenue was from General Motors through their integrated dealership management program. Considering how integral GM was to the business, you would think that Bob would treat them very well. But in 2007, GM ended up filing a lawsuit against Reynolds, accusing them of refusing to make requested changes to the software. Reynolds ended up settling with GM a year later, which ended the GM partnership. Somehow, Reynolds had already lost their biggest customer just 2 years after Bob took over. But Bob didn't care, as he had his eye on a much bigger prize. In 2007, a company called CoinData came out with a product called Docupad. Docupad is basically a large tabletop tablet that eliminates the need for paperwork when selling a car. This makes it much easier for car salesmen to upsell customers on insurance programs and amenities that they simply don't need. Despite the appealing product, most car dealerships avoided the system given that it was extremely expensive. CoinData charged $10,000 to set up each system, and then an additional $1,000 every month as a maintenance fee. And if a dealership wanted to modify anything, they were charged an extra $297 for each modification. CoinData had a tough time getting dealerships to pick up these tabs, but Bob wasn't worried about that. In 2009, he offered to form an exclusive marketing partnership with CoinData, and over the next 2 years, they revamped the system. In 2011, the duo came out with a new Docupad, and with Bob at the wheel, these sold like hotcakes. It's still not clear if these systems are actually worth it for dealerships, but there was no question that they were worth it for Bob. By this point, Bob was raking in billions, and though his business could be labeled as immoral or unethical, it definitely wasn't illegal. It would have been in Bob's best interest to keep it this way, but unfortunately, it didn't take long for greed to get to him. In the late 1990s, an investment banker from Goldman Sachs named Robert F. Smith reached out to Bob. Originally, he offered to buy out UCS from Bob, but Bob turned the script on Robert. Bob offered to help Robert start up a new investment bank called Vista Equity Partners with $1 billion. But in return, Bob wanted Robert to help him set up a foreign trust that did not report to the IRS. Technically, there were legal ways to accomplish this and legitimate reasons to do so, but I think it was pretty clear that Bob was going to use this for illegal purposes. Nonetheless, this was an opportunity of a lifetime for Robert, so he took up Bob on the offer. The Department of Justice has since labeled this deal as evidence of conspiracy and scheme and artifice to defraud. So here's how the fraud worked. Bob owned a charitable trust called Eugene Brockman that was based in Bermuda. This charitable trust owned a holding company called Spanish Steps Holding registered in Nevis, and Spanish Steps Holdings owned a company called Point Investments which was registered in the British Virgin Islands, and Point Investments was investing in Vista's foreign fund. Bob used this convoluted string of companies to funnel money offshore and avoid taxes. Bob and Robert got away with this for decades, but eventually the IRS caught on. Robert didn't resist the IRS much and quickly turned on Bob. When he took in the investment from Bob, he knew that this could eventually happen and he was prepared for it. Robert worked with the IRS to give them all the information they needed, and he happily paid a $139 million fine for his involvement in the scheme. From his perspective, the deal with Bob was well worth it. Vista Equity Partners had grown to $86 billion in assets under management, which made Robert worth $8.9 billion. Considering this, a $139 million fee wasn't that bad. As for Bob, his lawyers tried to argue that he was suffering from dementia and that he couldn't serve jail time, but courts dismissed this argument in November. We don't know what the final sentence is going to be, but it's probably not going to be that forgiving. At this point though, it doesn't really matter that much. Bob is already 80 years old, so he's already avoided paying for his crimes for most of his life. Aside from this, the latest account suggests that Bob is worth $4.7 billion. So even if he was charged a multi-$100 million fine or even a $1 billion fine, it wouldn't actually hurt him that much financially. Really, the worst punishment he could get at this point is being forced to live out his last days in jail. And that might very well end up happening, but we'll just have to wait and see. What do you guys think should be Bob's punishment? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you're glad that Bob gave car dealers a taste of their own medicine. And of course, consider checking out our international channels to watch our videos in other languages, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.